Dr. Heidegger's Experiment by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That very singular man, old Dr. Heidegger, once invited 4 venerable friends to meet him in his study. There were 3 white-bearded gentlemen, Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, and Mr. G, because I don't know how to say that word, and a withered gentlewoman, whose name was Widow Wycherly. They were all melancholy old creatures, who had been unfortunate in life, and whose greatest misfortune it was that they were not long ago in their graves. Mr. Medbourne, in the vigor of his age, had been a prosperous merchant, but had lost all by his frantic speculation, and was now little better than a mendicant. Colonel Killigrew had wasted his best years and his health and substance in the pursuit of sinful pleasures, which had given birth to a brood of pains such as the gout, divers, and other torments of soul and body. Mr. G was a ruined politician, a man of evil fame, or at least had been so till time buried him from the knowledge of the present generation and made him obscure instead of infamous. As for the widow Wycherly, tradition tells us that she was a great beauty in her day, but for a long while past she had lived deep in seclusion on account of certain scandalous stories which had prejudiced the gentry of the town against her. It is a circumstance worth mentioning that each of these 3 old gentlemen, Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, and Mr. G, were early lovers of the widow Wycherly, and had once been on the point of cutting each other's throats for her sake. And before proceeding further, I will merely hint that Dr. Heidegger and his foul guests were sometimes thought to be a little beside themselves, as it is unfrequently the case with old people, when worried either by present troubles or woeful recollections. "My dear old friends," said Dr. Heidegger, motioning to them to be seated, "I'm desirous of your assistance in one of those little experiments with which I amuse myself here in my study." If all stories were true, Dr. Heidegger's study must have been a very curious place. It was dim, old-fashioned chamber, festooned with cobwebs and besprinkled with antique dust. Around the walls stood several oaken bookcases, the lower shelves of which were filled with rows of gigantic folios and black-letter quartos, and the upper with little parchment-covered duodecimos. Over the central bookcase was a bronze bust of Hippocrates, with which, according to some authorities, Dr. Heidegger was accustomed to hold consultations in all different cases of his practice. In the obscurest corner of the room stood a tall and narrow oaken closet, with its door ajar, within which doubtfully appeared a skeleton. Between 2 of the bookcases hung a looking-glass, presenting its high and dusty plate with a tarnished gilt frame. Among many wonderful stories were related of this mirror. It was fabled that the spirits of all the doctor's deceased patients dwelt within its verge, and would stare him in the face whenever he tilt thither. The opposite side of the chamber was ornamented with a full-length portrait of a young lady, arrayed in the faded magnificence of silk, satin, and brocade, and with a visage as faded as her dress. Above half a century ago, Dr. H. had been on the point of marriage with this young lady, but being affected with some slight disorder, she swallowed one of her lover's prescriptions and died on the bridal evening. The greatest curiosity of the study remains to be mentioned. It was a ponderous folio volume bound in black leather with massive silver clasps. There were no letters on the back, and nobody could tell the title of the book. But it was well known to be a book of magic, and once, when a chambermaid had lifted it merely to brush away the dust, the skeleton had rattled in its closet, the picture of the young lady had stepped 1 foot on the floor, and several ghastly faces had peeped forth from the mirror, while the brazen head of Hippocrates frowned and said, "Forbear!" Such was Dr. Heidegger's study. On the summer afternoon of our tale, a small round table, as black as ebony, stood in the center of the room, sustaining a cut-glass vase of beautiful form and an elaborate workmanship. The sunshine came through the window between the heavy festoons of the 2 faded damask curtains, and fell directly across the vase, so that a mild splendor was reflected on the ashen visages of the old 5 people who sat around. 4 champagne glasses were also on the table. "My dear old friends," repeated Dr. Heidegger, "may I reckon your aid in performing an exceedingly curious experiment?" Now, Dr. Heidegger was a strange old gentleman whose eccentricity had become the nucleus for thousands of fantastic stories. Some of these fables, to my shame be it spoken, might possibly be traced back to my own voracious self, and if any passages of the present tale should startle the reader's faith, I must be content to bear the stigma of a fiction monger. When the doctor's four guests heard him talk of his proposed experiment, they anticipated nothing more wonderful than the murder of a mouse in an air pump, or the examination of a cobweb by the microscope, or some similar nonsense which he was constantly in the habit of pestering his inmates. But without waiting for a reply, Dr. Heidegger hobbled across the chamber and returned with the same ponderous folio bound in black leather, which a common report affirmed to be a book of magic. Undoing the silver clasps, he opened the volume and took along his black letter pages a rose, or what was once a rose, and now though the green leaves and crimson petals had turned brownish blue, and the ancient flowers seemed to be ready to crumble to dust in the doctor's hands. "This rose," said Dr. Heidegger with a sigh, "this same withered and crumbling flower blossomed 55 years ago. It was given to me by Sylvia Ward, whose portrait hangs yonder. I meant to wear it in my bosom for our wedding. 55 years it has been treasured between the leaves of this old volume. Now, would you deem it possible that this rose of half a century could ever bloom again?" "Nonsense," said Widow Wycherly in a peevish toss of her head. "You might as well ask whether an old woman's wrinkled face could ever bloom again." "See," answered Dr. Heidegger. He uncovered the vase and threw the faded rose into the water which it contained. At first it lay on the surface of the fluid, appearing to imbibe none of its moisture. Soon, however, a single change began to be visible. The crushed and dried petals stirred and assumed a deepening tinge of crimson, as if the flower were reviving from a death-like slumber. The slender stalk and twigs of the foliage became green, and there was the rose of half a century looking as fresh as when Sylvia Ward had first given it to her lover. It was scarcely full-blown, for some of its delicate red leaves curled modestly around its moist bosom, within which 2 or 3 dew-droppings were sparkling. "This is certainly a very pretty deception," said the doctor's friends, carelessly, however, for they had witnessed greater miracles at a conjurer's show. "Pray, how was it effected?" "Did you ever hear of the Fountain of Youth?" asked Dr. Heidegger, "which Ponce de Leon, the Spanish adventurer, went to in search of 2 or 3 centuries ago?" "But did Ponce de Leon ever find it?" said the Widow Wycherly. "No," answered Dr. Heidegger, "for he sought it in the right place. He never sought it in the right place. The famous Fountain of Youth, if I am rightly informed, is situated in the southern part of the Floridian Peninsula, not far from Lake Macaco. Its source is overshadowed by several gigantic magnolias, which, through numberless centuries old, have been kept fresh as violets by the virtues of the water. Acquaintance of mine, knowing my curiosity in such matters, he sent me what you see in the vase." "Ahem," said Colonel Killigrew, who believed not a word of the doctor's story. "And what may be the effect of his fluid on the human frame?" "You shall judge for yourself, my dear Colonel," replied Dr. Heidegger, "and all of you, my respected friends, are welcome to do so much of this admirable fluid as may restore you to the bloom of youth. For my own part, having had much trouble in growing old, I'm in no hurry to grow young again. With your permission, therefore, I will merely watch the progress of the experiment." While he spoke, Dr. Heidegger had been filling the 4 champagne glasses with water of the Fountain of Youth. It was apparently impregnated with the effervescent gas, for little bubbles were continually ascending from the depths of the glasses, and bursting in silvery spray at the surface. As the liquid diffused a pleasant perfume, the old people doubted not that it possessed cordial and comfortable properties, and though utter skeptics to its rejuvenescent power, they were inclined to swallow it at once, but Dr. H. besought them to stay a moment. "Before you drink, my responsible old friends," he said, "it would be well that with the experience of a lifetime directed you, you should draw up a few general rules for your guidance in passing a second time through the perils of youth. Think what a sin and shame it would be if, with your particular advantages, you should not become patterns of virtue and wisdom to all the young people of age." The doctor's 4 venerable friends made him no answer except by a feeble and tremulous laugh, so ridiculous the idea that, knowing how closely repentance treads behind the steps of error, they should ever go astray again. "Drink, then," said Dr. bowing. "I rejoice I have so well selected the subjects of my experiment." With palsied hands, they raised the glasses to their lips. The liquor, if it really possessed such virtues as Dr. Heidegger imputed it, could not have bestowed on 4 human beings who needed it more woefully. They looked as if they never knew what youth or pleasure was, but had been the offspring of nature's dotage, and always the gray, decrepit, sapless, miserable creatures who now sat stooping around the doctor's table, without life in their souls or bodies to even be animated by the prospect of going young again. They drank off the water and placed their glasses on the table. Assuredly, there was almost immediate improvement in the aspect of the party. Not unlike what might have been produced by a glass of generous wine, together with a sudden glow of cheerful sunshine brightened all over their visages at once. There was a healthful suffusion on their cheeks, instead of the ashen hue that made them look so corpse-like. They gazed at one another and fancied that some magic power really had begun to smooth away the deep and sad inscriptions which Father Time had so long engraved in their brows. The widow Wycherley adjusted her cap, and she felt almost like a woman again. "Give us more of this wondrous water," she cried eagerly. "We are younger, but we're still too old. Give us more." "Patience, patience," quoth Dr. H., who sat watching the experiment with philosophical coolness. "You have been a long time growing old. Surely it might content to grow young in a half an hour. But the water is at your service." Again he filled their glasses with the liquor of youth, enough of which still remained in the vase to turn half the old people in the city the age of their own grandchildren. While the bubbles were yet sparkling on the brim, and the doctor's 4 guests snatched their glasses from the table and swallowed the contents at a single gulp. Was it delusion? While even the draught was passing through their throats, it seemed to have wrought a change on their whole systems. Their eyes grew clearer and bright. A dark shade deepened in their silvery locks. They sat around the table, 3 gentlemen of middle age, and a woman hardly beyond her buxom prime. "My dear widow, you are charming," cried Colonel Killigrew, whose eyes had been fixed upon her face, while the shadow of age was flitting from it like darkness from the crimson daybreak. The fair widow knew of old that Colonel Killigrew's compliments were not only measured by sober of truth, so she started up and ran to the mirror, and still dreading that ugly visage of an old woman would meet her gaze. Meanwhile, the 3 gentlemen behaved in such a manner that proved the water of Fountain Youth possessed some intoxicating qualities, unless indeed their exhilarations of spirits were merely a lightsome dizziness caused by sudden removal of the weight of years. Mr. G's mind seemed to run on political topics, but whether relating to the past, present, or future could not easily be determined, since the same ideas and phrases had been in vogue these 50 years. Now he rattled forth full-throated sentences about patriotism and national glory and the people's rights, and he muttered some perilous stuff or other in sly and doubtful whisper, so cautiously that even his own conscience could scarcely catch the secret. And now again he spoke in measured accents and a deepingly deferential tone, as if royal ear were listening to his well-turned periods. Colonel Killigrew all this time had been trolling a 4th jolly bottle song and ringing his glass in a symphony with the chorus, while his eyes wandered toward the buxom figure of Widow Wycherley. On the other side of the table, Mr. Medbourne was involved in a calculation of dollars and cents, which was strangely intermingled a project for supplying the East Indies with ice by harnessing a team of whales to the polar icebergs. As for the widow Wycherley, she stood before the mirror, curtsying and simpering to her own image, and greeting it as the friend whom she loved better than all the world beside. She thrust her face to the glass to see some long-remembered wrinkle or crow's foot had indeed vanished. She examined whether the snow had entirely melted from her hair, and the venerable cap could be safely thrown aside. At last, turning briskly away, she came with a sort of dancing step to the table. "My dear old doctor," she cried, "pray me a favor with another glass." "Certainly, my dear madam, certainly," replied the complacent doctor. "See, I have already filled the glass." There, in fact, stood 4 glasses, brimful of this wonderful water. The delicate spray of it, which effervesced from the surface, resembled the tremendous glitter of diamonds. It was now so nearly sunset that the chamber had grown duskier than ever, but a mild and moonlike splendor gleamed from within the vase, and rested alike on the 4 guests. Rested alike on the 4 guests and on the doctor's venerable figure. He sat high-backed, elaborately carved, oaken armchair, with grey dignity of aspect that might be well befitted by Father Time, whose power had never been disputed, save this fortune company. Even while quaffing the 3rd draught of the Fountain of Youth, they were almost in awe by the expression of his mysterious visage.